And we have a very special program for you tonight, a conversation with an artist so many of us admire, have been watching for years with delight to see what new creative flowerings she would share with us. Of course, I'm talking about Carrie Mae Weems. She is much quoted, and I think we will even ask her to share with us some of her inspirations. The quote that I love, that speaks to me, and maybe you, is that art has saved my life on a regular basis. Yes, there is much to understand about that great quote. Her interlocutor tonight is our fabulous time-based curator, Dr. Saisha Grayson. And Saisha has put together a really interesting, fascinating exhibition called Musical Thinking, New Video Art and Sonic Strategies, bringing together the newly acquired pieces in the collection in conversation with the power of music, something we can all relate to. And this exhibition can be found on the 3rd floor in the Kniff Galleries. Saisha also co-curated with John Jacob, the McAvoy family curator for photography, a focus exhibition called Carrie Mae Weems, Looking Forward, Looking Back. And this is a pairing of a unbelievably unforgettable multimedia installation, Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me, and that transforms this new gallery into a 19th century illusionistic theater. And then we've paired this with 8 photographs from a very important series called Constructing History. So this is also on the 3rd floor for you tonight in a new state-of-the-art time-based media gallery, our own black box space. And then around it in a little L, we've built a gray space, lower light levels for works on paper and photographs, because there's often a conversation happening with video and works on paper. So, as I noted, this is a live streamed program. Over 1,000 people are participating with us tonight. So we will have a conversation, and then we invite questions for those online in the chat box. And for those of you here with us tonight, we have some note cards that we'll send around to organize the many questions that may arrive. So I'm going to invite you to the stage, and I say fasten your seatbelts. We're off and running for what promises to be a fascinating evening. Thank you again. Saisha, Carrie Mae Weems.
Sound good? How are we sounding out there? Everyone? Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining, everyone, but most importantly, thank you, Carrie Mae Weems, for joining me on stage. I have goosebumps, heart palpitations, just a little bit. And as Stephanie was mentioning, we're celebrating this very important evening, this opening of our 3rd floor, our modern and contemporary galleries, but also this spectacular, I think of it as a jewel box show of your work. So I think it's crazy to imagine that anybody doesn't know, but I think I need to introduce just a little bit about you, if you'll indulge me. So if you were unaware, so Carrie Mae Weems is perhaps best known for photography, but she works across a plethora of media, installation, video, textile, these kind of wraparound experiences, and increasingly performance and parades and public art, and so this whole range of projects. And that has brought you into collections around the world. It has you in solo feature shows, I think at the Barbican most recently in London. Where else? Your European shows were sort of everywhere this summer.
Right, yeah, at the Lumen Foundation in at the MACBA in Spain and Barcelona, and traveling from there, and now going to Basel very soon, and to Sweden for the Hasselblad Award. So there's a lot of activity going on around this work. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting.
Yeah,
it's been
really
like
wonderful.
a resurgence or like a re-engagement because the work is so prescient and important to this time. I should also mention you're an official MacArthur Genius and the first, genius, and maybe a national treasure. That's my favorite term for you. And a moral compass that the work that you've done over these 4 decades has shown how art can kind of call us to our highest selves and to engage with some of the darkest moments in our past, and that's really important for how we step into the present and the future.
Thank you.
So that's what I kind of want to talk about. I think if we can start the slides, I would say the slides are going to be sort of just rotating behind us. You have so much work, there's no way that we could cover it all. But we'll start with the 2 projects that we acquired for the collection. So when people come see the show, everybody must come see the show. We have paired 2 projects. So the first is Constructing History, which was created in 2008, something you worked on with the Savannah College of Art and Design.
That's right, yes.
And the other is Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me, a story in 5 parts, which was made in 2012. And it was a commission for an exhibition called Feminist End. And so
It was.
It was. And so, I was actually really struck by that because it deals with so many topics. And what feminism means in that context is something I'm very interested in. But what I wanted to say was that when we were thinking about the body of your work and all the many things that would make sense here, these 2 really stood out as almost site-specific, like as if we had commissioned them. They're so speaking to this moment, and they speak to DC and the history here in a very particular way, but they were made for these other contexts. So I think for people who aren't familiar, maybe we can start with those moments.
Sure. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I have to say, first of all, what a remarkable, extraordinary moment to find my work here in this institution on these hallowed grounds in the United States of America, in Washington, D.C., in the new wing of this renovated space in the Lincoln Room. I mean, all of those things put together, I'm deeply honored and humbled as well. And there's always this sense for me as an artist, and there are a number of artists that are in the audience. Can I see a show of hands for the artists that are here, the artists that are here? So good to see you, right? That it always seems to me that when the work somehow becomes larger than me, it's when the work really does no longer belong to me. It actually belongs to the public in the deepest possible way. That I'm simply the medium, that I'm simply the carrier, I'm simply the vessel that brought the work, but that the ideas, the making, the material means, the effort, the energy, all of those things actually come in some other kind of way. They almost come from outside of you, and they motivate you, and they become these sort of guiding lights, these guiding principles. And the thing that's very interesting about working with organizations and institutions, in part, I completely forgot about the Mattress Factory, which was the organization actually that commissioned Lonnie, Lincoln, and Me all those years ago, because I haven't spoken about the Mattress Factory for a number of years. But it was through their belief, really, in the work and the possibility of the work that they allowed me this room to develop a project that I wouldn't have been able to develop in any other way. That it was with their support that that work was actually possible, and for that I'm deeply grateful to them. I think that maybe they have a copy of Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me. Maybe they only decided to retain just the video portion as a kind of record. I think that it was one of those wonderful things where they allowed me to do whatever I wanted to do with the work, but they were simply the aid there to assist artists in their making, in their practice, which is really wonderful.
Yeah, and then, in a different way, SCAD, you were teaching there, and so you were engaged with students and classroom, and it's 2008, so that's the 40th anniversary.
They're going to start slides sometime soon. Too.
I see our tech crew arriving, so I'm wondering what's. There we go. Oh, there we go. I knew that they'd come eventually. So what we're seeing is the beginning of constructing history in these 8. This is a larger series. There's many images in the project, but these are the ones we actually selected with you. Thank you so much for being part of that conversation. And they're really the ones that are where you see the staging most clearly, where you see this question of both how an image is made, but it's also this invitation for different people you were working with to step in to key moments in history that we really know through photography. So it's this incredible blending of so many of the concerns and the ways you work. And which part of that came out of working with the students, and what did you show up with to the class? I'm curious.
I've made many of my own photographs, going out into the world, photographing, building my own personal archive over many years. But I've also appropriated images too, particularly historical materials, historical images. And for a major piece called "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried" was one of those pieces. All of the work, for the most part, is based on appropriated imagery. Very, very important piece, because I really wanted to indeed interrogate contemporary photography, and the history of photography, in the history of African Americans in photography, within American photography. Like there were all of these touch points that I wanted to experience in the work, and the only way to do that was to appropriate existing materials, to use those materials, and certainly some of the materials that come out of the National Archives, right, are a part of the piece as well. But I also got a lot of pushback. And it took me like an enormous amount of time. It was like an enormous amount of energy, contacting all the artists, and, having the great Robert Frank threaten to sue me for the use of his images, and having Harvard threaten to sue me for the use of their images. And I thought, that was a great idea, you should. but it was also just exhausting. Bring it. It's like, how many battles can a girl fight? So, so for me, and maybe, Allison is there, other artists are in the audience, for me, you work really hard. You get up every morning and you go to that studio and you're just in it and you're working, right? But it's really, after you've done all that work, it's really when you allow your body to rest that certain ideas, like it's in that sort of twilight zone between being awake and asleep, that ideas really begin to surface because you've put in the labor, you've put in the work, and your body is telling you what that work has been, and then how to honor the work. So I knew that this project was coming with SCAD. I've been thinking about Roger Moore, a very important civil rights photographer. I didn't want to be into any sort of skirmishers and quarrels, and I didn't want to upset him because I value him so much. And one morning, early, I was with my husband, Jeff Hoon. We were just resting. And the ideas of how to make this piece with my students at SCAD just literally emerged. They just emerged from some deep well. And all I needed to do was to pay attention to what it was saying to me, how it was calling me. And so that I knew that I would have to reconstruct and remake these significant moments that had happened in American history, and that I would use my students as a way of dealing with it, and that in the process of making, they would themselves understand something about history, that they would be able to step into the shoes of that person and know something physically in a way that they'd never known it before. Something about American history, something about the assassinations that had rocked the country, that were so important to the country. Of course, we start with the assassination of Lincoln, right? Which is a part of another project. But this idea that I could use my students as the source and the subject, as the interrogators for the making of the work, was really quite wonderful. And then I decided that we would use all of the tools of the making. How is the actual image made, right? So that you see the tracks, and you see the lights, and you see the barn doors, right? That all of that is framed and carefully constructed so that you know that you're actually looking at something that has been remade. Yeah. Something that is really a notation and a reference to something that existed before. And it was a wonderful way of really pulling together this material and living with the material and working with my students over a period of time to make it. And the thing was so interesting, just the other day, no kidding, I was at the Brooklyn Museum, as Aisha was there as well, for the opening of Magdalena Campos Pan's exhibition. And one of my students from Constructing History, whom I haven't seen since that time. Yeah. It was, what year did we make this?
2008.
In 2008 was the first time that I saw her. And I knew that the project had been, we talk about the power of art to change lives, the power of art to change lives. The students who entered my class at SCAD, some of them were historians, some of them were photographers. There were various people from various backgrounds. This young woman, she had been, I think, involved in photography, but decided completely based on her experience in this class to change from photography to sculpture and then to performance. And that has been her life. Somebody that entered as a photographer also decided to do history. So that, right, that there's a way that the work was really having an impact on the people that were involved, my subjects and my students, in the making of the project. It was very exciting, very rewarding project.
And I think actually what that modeling does for audiences is actually they're the next stage of that practice, right? When you understand that the image is constructed and you understand that students did this work of stepping in and the interpretation that happens there, then I think audiences start to ask themselves, how would I step into that moment? What do I remember about that image? Where did I first see it? Did I deconstruct it myself? So I think that there's a real kind of bigger circle that it opens up to.
I think so. I think the other thing that it does, that I think is even, that's also very important, is that we start to understand that no matter what kind of image you're seeing, they're all constructed. Yeah. They're all made, right? They're all coming from the position of orchestration, and within that there's still depth and meaning and beauty and truth and honesty. And sometimes deception, other things can be there as well, right? But we understand that images are made and that people make them and that they make all kinds of decisions in relationship to the thing that is made and to the thing that is ultimately presented before the public. And I think that's important, whether you're looking at photographs or video or film or painting, whatever it is that you're looking at, you begin to understand that this is a constructed piece, right? That it can still have depth and again, as I was saying, and profound honesty, but we have to understand that they are constructions.
Absolutely, and it's like another level of appropriation. As you said, appropriation's a long-standing part of your practice in certain ways, but I think this level where the appropriation is also deconstructed in and of itself is very interesting. The other thing that you do that I think is quite unique and very effective is you sort of self-appropriate a lot. There's a lot of these kind of callbacks and references within the works themselves. So one of the reasons we, in addition to the way that these works really speak to national history in a very particular way, there's also a relationship between them where you literally see a fragment of footage from the scenes of constructing history where JFK, your students are reenacting that famous footage, the Zapruder footage, and then you see that floating in the space of Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me. And I was always interested in this aspect of your work too, the kind of cyclical revisiting, reprocessing, and how that in some way seems to relate to your ideas about the way the past acts in the present. Could you talk about that a bit?
Well, I have a difficult time throwing away anything, primarily my shoes. They go back decades. Oh, it's hilarious. But everything is the same.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, everything is the same. I'm negotiating at any given moment. I'm thinking about many of the same things. I've been thinking about the same questions since I was 8. Right? How do you negotiate the world? What is this thing that we're in? What is this life that we're in? What are the issues and the concerns? What are my issues and concerns? And how do I articulate them? Why do I care so much about social justice? Why do I care so much about equality? Why do I care so much about what happens to other people? Why do I care about what happens to Black people? Well, these are ongoing concerns. Baraka, Mary Baraka, I think, said it so beautifully in his notion of the changing same. Right? Yes. That the more things change, the more things remain the same. And so there's this material, there are these ideas. I think that for the most part, all of us, everybody in the audience, has only several concerns that you return to over and over and over and over. And the thing that you're trying to figure out at any given moment in your life is how to discuss it now, how to deal with it now, how to make the work now. Right? So whether I'm looking at, this work from Rome and standing in front of sort of large structures that speak about power and the power of place, the power of the Roman Empire, or if I'm standing in front of museums and looking at what museums are doing, what they're not doing, how they've behaved, how they've responded to the call for change and the call for justice, right? Or if I'm looking at my relationship to Cuba and the way in which Cuba sort of unpacks itself and unpacking the revolution of Cuba and standing in Santiago, all of these things are connected, right? So these ideas continue to sort of float. They float across time and across circumstance. So the thing that has always been so extraordinary to me, particularly living in this our great country, is that during the civil rights movement, during the 60s, our primary leaders were assassinated in the United States of America. Yeah. Right? Maybe you expect this in South America or in Asia or in some place, but you don't expect it here, right? And those terms, those assassinations, have impacted us in a deep and sustained way.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty amazing. So that has shaped the country in part.
Yeah.
In part, we have to realize that it has shaped in part who we are and what we remember, what we think, how we define ourselves, what we think is valuable, what we think is meaningful. what we think we really must pay attention to. So those ideas then are simply there. They're layered through the work. They keep coming back to the work. They keep coming back because they mean something, and because they're so important about, I think, who we are. And so reusing them, pulling those materials back into the work in an ongoing way is probably something that I'll probably continue to do, even though I collect and I make many things. I continue to come back to the same body of work often.
As somebody who continues to follow the work, it's so enriching, because that return and the way that figures and world building kind of come back, and you can see a technique like your body standing in place, the kind of question that your physical presence in this scene from these TV shows, and how that is different than the Rome work, how you are pressing against something else, but using this structure that those of us who have been following your work understand as this continuing pressing against institutions and towards institutions, and asking them sort of where they're making space for you and how you show up. So I think of it as a kind of Easter egg. There's that potential to kind of see these figures. Another one that's in Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me is this trickster figure. And kind of Joker, Faustian character. And that, I think, starts in 2000, 2004 for you, and then recently has kind of come back as an important metaphor. I think the circus and the carnival in recent works.
I've been fascinated with circus for, maybe 30 years, and, I've spent time in, the circus museums, and, looked at clowns, studied clowns, South American clowns, American clowns, particularly the ones of the 30s were fascinating. German clowns from the 30s and 40s were fabulous. Faust is amazing. These are like really beautiful, beautiful, beautiful characters, and so I've been trying to figure out for a long time, for years, like how to build my character, how to build her, and then to determine her actions, how she would act in the world. And so I developed her, I think, in around 2000, and 2006 I took her on the road for the first time, where she was selling hopes and dreams. And the elections were just beginning. I can't remember who was running that year. Who was running like in 2004?
Come on, DC.
Right?
Clinton years?
Who's running?
Carrie.
Right. So but I've also been looking at ideas about voting rights. Oh, of course. What that meant. The colleges and what that meant, and understanding that the popular vote doesn't always translate into who actually, wins the presidency. That became, sort of problematic. So the idea of one man, one vote, well, if we have that, but it doesn't necessarily translate then into who enters the White House. And so I thought that there was something tricky about that.
Yeah.
and so I took that idea of the trickster and the trick, and this way in which I think democracy lands on a slippery slope into these actions that I would perform in New York and on the subway and in stations, and it was very interesting with signs and et cetera. So I lived with her for a long time. She's interesting.
And now there's this installation at Park Avenue Armory, The Shape of Things, where the kind of cyclorama and the dioramas and the carnival barker became metaphors again, I think, for democracy and this question of sort of whose voices are heard and what gets hidden as that cyclorama kind of moves around, and the dioramas. It was very, very moving as an entire
You came to that exhibition.
Yeah.
I think that was the first time we actually met.
Absolutely. And Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me was there. It was one of the chances to kind of see that work. It's quite hard to understand that work until you step into
see it. Yeah.
You're using a technique there called Pepper's Ghost.
Yes.
And that was, originally a 19th century theater illusion technique with electrical lights and glass sheets.
Glass, yeah.
And you updated it using video projection and kind of a Mylar. I don't want to give away the trick a little bit, but it's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's so simple. And really, the reason that it really came about is because I couldn't afford a hologram, right? I just couldn't afford it, right? I couldn't afford it. I didn't know how to make it. So it was like easier just to sort of figure out something else. And it was through, again, the Mattress Factory that we sort of got to that, to this trick. I remembered from seeing it, like an early German films, like, oh.
But I've heard you say this before, and I really wanted to ask, because then when I started doing research into this, the year of its highest popularity was 1863. So I was curious at what point you also realized that it was
well, I'm not that old.
No, that's not what I was saying. But it was the same historic moment as the Civil War. It's the moment of Lincoln, right? So that the technique and the technology that you found your way to in your creative, seeking for this effect ends up resonating so closely.
Yeah, it's really
with the theater moment.
Yeah.
And so then I need to ask you a dark question, which is, so this piece is upstairs. We've mentioned that it's in the Lincoln Gallery where Lincoln had his inaugural ball. I didn't realize this until we were installing. We're also just a block and a half from Ford Theater.
Yes, we passed there yesterday, my husband and I.
So that gave me chills. And so this question, you do return to Assassinations in a number of works. It's a profound question that you ask, which is, what are we willing to do when we don't get our way? And so I was curious, we had a chance to quickly see it, what do you think about these works and what the lessons might be here in a city that, might be defined by the challenge of, what we do when we're trying to govern in a democratic way and not everybody can get their way?
I know that we're in a very deep and dark place, I think, generally. In the country, we've really entered a very scary time as far as I can see. And I know that, that we are willing to do just about anything to get our way, that certain people in the world are willing to do just about anything in order to get their way. And that we have to be really sort of ever vigilant. And the most important thing, the lesson is that there's a lesson. The lesson is that there's a lesson, that there's a way that we have to behave. If we actually want to foster something that's greater than what we know, that if we want to develop the deepest part of ourselves, the richest part of our humanity, then there has to be another way that we act in the world, and that the country is changing, and it's changing in a very profound way. I keep using this phrase that I've sort of, that's my sort of like my haiku, that we've shifted from white to black and varying shades of brown. That the country has done that. And I followed this demographic shift for a very long time. I've watched it for a very long time, trying to understand exactly what it would mean. And now we know, in a lot of ways, what it means to a country that isn't ready for it, to a group of people that were not ready for it, and to people that are willing to hold on to power regardless, which gives us something like Donald Trump, for instance, as the President of the United States. Shocking that, that he would be in the running at this point at all is shocking, considering where we are and what we know about the man. So there's a lot of work, I think, that we have to do, and the only thing that the work does is to simply remind us of the work that needs to be done and the work that has been done, and the possibilities and the things that are actually at stake. Because life is really at stake, and that's real.
Yeah.
It's not a hyperbole. It's
not at all.
real. So, that we introduce something like repeating the obvious, this idea that over and over and over and over and over and over and over, thousands and thousands and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men, black men, have been killed in this country, right? George Floyd becomes like a pinnacle for us in a way that sort of changes a whole lot of things. It expresses, or rather that brings forth questions in a remarkable way. But that's one life. That's one life. Pivotal significant for us because it's made us all, I think, at least those people that are deeply interested in pursuing deeper democracy and social justice and equality. It's made us reconsider our role and our action in relationship to the powers that be.
Yeah, the
So it's amazing to
repetition
see.
in your work and in your speaking. You have a way that you kind of come back to the rhythm of that thought that I think holds great power. It really kind of brings people into rhythm with you to kind of stay with it. There's a scene in the cyclorama where the same figure in a hoodie shows up over and over and over again. The impact of that is extraordinary. It really just lands in an incredibly visceral way, and you see that in the work. I was thinking maybe the images that are on view now are from an artist parade that you put together, and you were talking about sort of what you have to do, the lessons and the work. There's a lot of work to be done, and you started to move into spaces about saving lives. So a project during COVID-19 of moving into public space and really confronting the inequalities of how that was impacting different communities, then the parade. And so I was curious about this real active stepping into the public and the convenings, the kinds of convenings you've been doing too. How that relates to the thing you've always said, which is you're interested in power and who wields it. How are you thinking about this use of the platform and power that you have now?
Well, usually I'm thinking about when can I go to bed? When I like going to get some rest,
we got you for a little bit longer tonight, Carrie.
I mean, it's like an enormous amount of work.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, these projects, whether I'm looking at COVID or developing that project. I mean, I knew that this, that COVID was going to, initially that people of color and that workers were going to be seriously impacted by this. So we immediately started. I mean, literally the day of the lockdown, I was in my studio beginning to draft materials, creating materials, and calling up every institution that I could think of to partner with me in order to sort of get the word out, to spread the word in any way that we could, right? So all of the ways that I could think of, from masks to posters to flyers to buttons and bows, anything that, shopping bags and grocery bags and all these materials that went out into the world, and billboards and broadsides, and it was just this, it was a great project. It sustained me over the course of the pandemic. I was able to work with a great group of young people here and there, and so it was very important that again that it was a real thing, that it was a real crisis, and that I knew that art would matter. Yeah. I knew that it would have its impact, and it did.
And save lives, right?
When
you say there are real lives at stake.
And save
there are
lives.
real lives at stake in many of these valences.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was wonderful because universities, or rather institutions, hadn't really thought through it. Right? It's like, okay, so it was like this sort of gift.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, thank you. Like, we can use that, 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 right? We can use all of this material in our environment, and that's exactly what happened across the country and into England and into Africa as well. So it was like a kind of an amazing project that, that I started with a song and a dance and, $5 in my hand, but we actually managed to really get this material into
it was everywhere.
world.
And it was really a clarion cry that both artists matter, that the work we do and the way we communicate is so important, and that this line of criticality needed to be part of that conversation from the very beginning, as you said.
Yeah. When I kept thinking, every place I go, there's, things are either closed down now or nobody has any workers. All the restaurant, nobody has any workers. Like, everybody has a help wanted sign. And I realized, well, we lost about 1 million people in the United States, right?
We're not talking about that. We talk about it as we're not incentivizing the workers enough, right?
We lost about 1 million workers in the United States. And they were nurses and grocery shop and They were
bus
the
drivers in
people
New
that
York.
held those positions. That's why there's help wanted signs everywhere you go. I mean, it's just kind of amazing, right? So yeah, it was a really important project, and thanks for mentioning it. Nobody has.
You
in
made
a
me just
while.
think of something interesting. You talk about how the U.S. hasn't fully reckoned with these assassinations. We also haven't reckoned with this loss, right? That those are two different things that we would think are not, things we'd expect here, or losses that we'd expect here that would mark history, mark economics, social structures, that these are going to have profound changes and impacts that we'll be marking for decades.
They have had profound impact, and I think it's a part of both the wonderful thing about Americans is that we're forever hopeful. We're people we don't really like complaining, which is why my husband is always angry at me because I always complain.
My husband too.
Right? But we want to look at the bright side of things, right? And it's a kind of a wonderful quality, and yet it's also, I think, our worst quality. It's like both.
Yeah.
So that like in America, there's always a happy ending, but most things really don't end happily. I mean, life is really, really complicated, and so a part of our culture doesn't really allow us to deal with the complicated structures of who we are, which is why it's very difficult for us to deal with questions of race and racism, systemic racism, why it's so difficult to sort of change those patterns, because it's difficult to have those conversations. No matter where you go and no matter what group of people that you're amongst, for the most part, it's very difficult to have really deep, strong conversations and differences about what you feel and what you think. It's a part of our culture. And it's the worst part of our culture and the best part of our culture.
I'm going to say so many things to that. So one of the voiceovers you have is that hope is the thing hoped for, and I feel like that comes through in so much of your work. It was something I was thinking about. As Stephanie mentioned, you have so many quotes that they sort of make me sit back and I spend time meditating, like how do I want to show up in the world with this idea? So thank you for that. But complexity is so important. It's the thing that I hope for. And it's the thing that I hope your work in relationship to the reinstallation really invites, because one of the things, we titled the show Looking Forward, Looking Back. That's a title from Constructing History, one of the prints. But it also is this thing, as I said, that so much of your work does. It sort of insists that the past, present, and future entangled. If we want to imagine other possibilities looking forward, we're going to have to look back. And that is what this collection is, right? That is what, when you have a collection that is dedicated to American art, to who gets to be seen, what uses and framings and constructions have built the story that we know till now, and then what other possibilities, how can we look at those differently when we show up in the present, when contemporary artists come in and ask us to look again at something in a new way. So I really think that the possibility of your work and its complexity is really, it's site-specific because it's Lincoln Gallery, but it's also site-specific because it's the philosophy that we also have for this reinstallation and what we're hoping to do here.
Well, congratulations. I was wondering about this, about how out of all of the artists that are contemporarily at work, there's extraordinary work in the world. How do you make the decision about what you're going to acquire? What you're going to bring into space?
Well, you made it very easy, so you had this work called Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me. And so we were talking about this. When I applied for this job, I included this work in my PowerPoint. I mean, this was in my job talk. I was like, we need this work. This is, but it was also that this is what the work here is, that the work of this institution is what this work does, what we all need to be doing, coming back to that. So in some cases, it's a no-brainer. It's just, you had to be here, that work had to be here, that conversation had to be had now. In other ways, I would admit that it can be overwhelming in that there's so many important perspectives
Right.
that we want to see here,
Right.
and so many voices that have a lot to tell us about
Right.
who we are as a nation.
Right.
So that work can very often be, serendipitous. It's the moment when I'm putting together a show about musical thinking, and I know that there's artists who are exactly using music to express something that needs to be said right now. So that's the work that I'll do tomorrow, and the next project will allow me to kind of focus on the next set of artists that need to be here. But it is challenging. But I will say
Yes.
that one of the great things about working at an institution that has this frame is it is a very particular frame. It's about this nation. It's about how we understand ourselves, how we
Right.
project ourselves into the world. And so the chance to think about which artists move that along is enormous. And so
It's really quite incredible. But I suppose in some ways, too, that it has to do with really, museums are very, very defined spaces, right? I mean, this is really, I love this building, beautiful, beautiful building. But, what are the other ways that we sort of begin to think about museum? What are the other ways that we think about as artists participating in the outside of the structure? What are the other tools that are at work? What's the future, really, of museums and the future of these collections? So my husband and I, Jeff is really, really great. And so,
Yay, Jack.
so I'm doing this project. I'm doing a project, in a couple of weeks. We've just finished one on reparations, which was really fascinating, that my own work sort of brought me to. I always thought that I disagreed with this notion, but suddenly here I am doing a project about reparations because I really wanted to understand it. And now, in a few weeks, I'm doing a project on contested monuments, contested sites at Syracuse University. Very much looking forward to doing this project. We have Monuments Lab involved. They've just did their project here on the National Mall. The Mellon Foundation, who developed an extraordinary initiative around monuments, and the sort of re-articulation of monuments in public space. And Hank Willis Thomas is going to be with us, and I think maybe Deb is here this evening. His fabulous mother and great friend and art historian is here, but Hank is going to be with us, and Hamza Walker, who's doing this large exhibition on contested monuments that have been decommissioned monuments that have been moved into storage. He and Kara Walker are doing this large exhibition with decommissioned monuments soon. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. The thing that's really interesting to me, and the thing that Jeff really helped me to get to, is that yes, we are dealing with these sort of contested sites. And there are a number of voices. There are a number of voices to be heard around what should be decommissioned, what should be maintained, how should it be maintained, etc. Right? How do we work around these sort of ideas of conflict resolution? Is there a way that you and I, though we may have differences and a different set of beliefs, is there still yet a way for us to share space? And what are the tools for sharing this space? And a part of really looking at the institution is a museum is not unlike that, right?
Yeah.
That you have to make these decisions about what you decide to show, and therefore you're also making the decision about what to leave
Not show.
out.
And I'm going to use that maybe to transition, because the other thing that we think about so much with institutions is audience and what the conversation they want to have is. So I think we might have questions from the audience, so I want to just double check if we're at that time for the evening. Yes, I thought we might be. So if you haven't written down a question, you are welcome to now. And Gloria, do you have a starting question for us?
No, because folks need cards.
Okay.
Don't have any from online.
Okay, so Well, then we can keep talking. So one of the things the conversation sort of came to this question of institutions around the same time that some of the images of
Oh, this is perfect, the Hampton Project.
of your projects, the Hampton Project, and also some of you've curated in spaces. And so I'm curious what you think when you get invited, like by the Guggenheim, to curate a project from their collection, or when you're curating your own work. Kind of, what are you thinking about from the side of the person who's stepping in?
Well, it's sort of different though, because in the case of curating the show for the Guggenheim, I was just simply dealing with the material that they had there. It was fascinating. It was a great project to do, and I love my project. I really
The
did.
photos
Very
look amazing.
biased.
That is
I'm
one
very
project I
biased,
missed.
but it was really quite beautiful. And I called it, what could have been. And I only used, for the most part, works that were black and white. So the Guggenheim, they really didn't, there were only these sort of four guys, for the most part, who collected for them early on, very different than the Modern or the Met. So they have a very, very, very sort of specific kind of collection, and there were these, guys that were touring around Europe, sort of, going to art studios and bidding one another for, they were just great, right? And so the collection is very specific, and so I was, just dealing with that. And of course, they didn't bring in African Americans or women for the most part, people of color for a very long time, only, sporadically here and there. And so I was just going through the collection and noticed that this was true. That there was, very little work, before the 80s. It was after the 80s that they began to collect women and African Americans. So the work was very, very, very specific. And it was really a way of unpacking not only the museum, what was in the museum and its collection, but also a sort of elegant way to talk about, again, what had been left out of their collection.
Yeah, so you've been on that side too, this kind of like the unpacking of what it is, the institution, the authority that comes with that, the picking and choosing. And I was interested to see that project, so I think it'll come around soon. So this, I think, is in relationship to the project you just mentioned. Somebody in the audience is curious, how do you think society will respond in good or maybe not ways to demands for reparations? What do you imagine that conversation is?
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
It was only through working on a project about my grandfather just recently, which is called Leave Now, about my grandfather, Frank Weems, and seeing him actually for the first time ever in my life, only a few years ago, in a photograph in his lawyer's office attempting to sue the state of Arkansas for his mistreatment, right? That he was in his lawyer's office attempting to sue the state of Arkansas for his mistreatment. And then finding the documents that there was a decision not to pursue his case, I thought that, maybe I should pursue his case. And maybe I should pursue it in a more general way. And that more general way actually became perhaps through the lens, through participation, through reparation. And so, and I don't know. But then, of course, I started doing my research, and this question now, right, of this thing that I thought 2 years ago was an impossible call, I realized, of course, is actually beginning to gain extraordinary momentum around the country, right? And that indeed, my grandfather, a song was written in his name and ultimately sung by Woody Guthrie through up and down the Union lines of the South. So it's been a very interesting. It's been a very interesting moment, and I think that it's going to really be that reparations will be the thing that we're looking at over the next 20 to 30 years. Really, how do we think about this? Laws are changing in the United States. California has a commission. Ohio has a commission. There are a number of states actually that are developing commissions to look at the case of reparation. So this is something that has really only emerged really in the last few years. though the first person to actually win reparation was in 1783 in Boston. A black Ghanaian woman who had been brought to the United States, and her owner dies. She sues the state. She petitions the state, and the state granted her reparations. That was 1783. That was the first case. So it's kind of fascinating.
That's amazing.
It's fascinating.
I want to say, I think we're coming to conclusion, but
Great.
I wanted to, yeah.
I want to go have a glass of champagne.
We will do that. I just wanted to say that I think that one of the things that the story you just told suggests is that imagination, when the foreclosure of what we think is possible is one way to contain it. And one of the things that I think artists do is reinvigorate that imagination of what's possible. So
thank you.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for doing that for us. Thank you for this conversation.
So wonderful. Wonderful. Great to be in conversation.
Champagne?